Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Charlie Bell. Now, Charlie is a man of many talents. He's a doctor, he's a priest, he's an academic. He's also a gay man in the Church of England. And Charlie, it's fabulous to get you on the Godcast. How are you doing?
Thanks. It's really great to be with you.
Whereabouts are you today? Where do we find you?
So I've been in one of my usual days of trying to do many different things at the same time. So I'm in South London at the moment, just outside of Kennington.
So for people who don't know you, Charlie, you've got quite a lot going on there. When we say all those things, just break that down for us a little bit. How does it all work in the life of Charlie Bell?
Well, I'd love to know. I work full time as a psychiatrist for the National Health Service, so that's my day job, as it were. I do some teaching at Cambridge for undergraduate medics, and I also am a priest in the Church of England. I'm serving a non-stipendiary, non-paid curacy just down the road from work at St John the Divine, Kennington. So I try and hold those things together. Sometimes one is rather more emphasized than the other, but it's a busy but exciting life.
Just tell us a little bit about your calling, Charlie, and how that came about. Was this something that had been burning away for some years, or did it kind of creep on you quite quickly?
I suppose it was a bit of both. It had been hanging around in the back of my mind for some time. And then when I got to university, it continued to hang around, and I thought, this is annoying. And then got in touch with the vocations advisor eventually, after putting it off for years and years, thinking, if I speak to her, at least she'll say, this is ridiculous, please go away, stop bothering us. And it didn't. And so I ended up going forward into the process. It's been a bit bumpy here and there, but no, it's always been there. I grew up as a chorister in a cathedral, so daily worship and all the rest of it has been a kind of part and parcel of my life, really. So I guess for my family, it wasn't a shock, but it was possibly a surprise that I ended up going forward for ordination.
Yeah, and as is very clear and open, you're a gay man, Charlie. I was wondering when you first may have discovered prejudice as a gay Christian.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's lots of people for whom their faith and their sexuality has been a kind of conflict, and that's never really been the case for me. Or it certainly wasn't until I got further into the church, really. I don't know when I knew I was gay. I mean, goodness only knows when people find out, really. But I never really knew I was anything else. It just became clear that was how things were going, and the church I was in at the time, and the school I was in, everything was just, church life was a kind of haven in a sense. Church was a safe place to be. It was a place where you could be yourself. It might not have been named as me being gay at that stage, but it wasn't a place where I was ever worried necessarily about naming it. It was only once I kind of went along to a Christian Union event, actually, and it was a barbecue, which was a good way to get people in. And so we had a barbecue, and then that was the first time I heard that God might have a problem with gay people, at which point I thought, oh, that sounds unusual and odd. And unlikely. And that was the first time that I'd really experienced it. And so yeah. And then as I got through further into the church and the rest of it, I suddenly realized that perhaps the charmed life that I'd lived up until that stage was not quite the experience for the majority of people who are gay and Christian.
As you entered that discernment process, did anybody try and put you off because of your sexuality? Were there kind of lots of warning signs about what lay ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think people in a well-meaning way say, are you sure about this? And it was generally people who themselves had no issue whatsoever with gay priests and the rest of it, and possibly themselves even were them, but would say, are you sure you're willing to let yourself in for all of this? And it's tough, isn't it? Because you don't know, and you think, yeah, it'll be fine, but we're all naive. And so there was a sense of kind of naivety, I think, in my determination to go forward. I mean, lots of people will know that the kind of official rules and the strictures that are placed around us and so on. But in a sense, I felt there was something I could do. There was something I could do as a gay priest that was worth doing.
Charlie, just unpack that for people, because a lot of people listen and watch the Godcast who who aren't churchy, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
You say about the rules and the kind of the things you can and you can't do. Just explain that to people who are listening to this and thinking, well, what rules? What's different for you than might be different for me as a heterosexual man?
Yeah, sure. So I'm speaking in June of 2023. Just it's useful to know that because things might change. But and I say that because I'm sitting on one of the groups that's reviewing and giving guidance and advice to the House of Bishops as to how things might change the decision making. But actually, at the moment, those of us who are gay as clergy are prohibited from having any sexually intimate relationships. So are committed to celibacy. And that's from the minute that you go into the process. You're asked to sign up to a document which is imaginatively named Issues in Human Sexuality, which rather suggests the truth, which is that we're often issues rather than people. And so we are told you must be celibate, and also we may not get married. So that has been the case. It's not possible to get married in the Church of England. It's against the law, but it's not. We're also not allowed to enter into civil marriages as clergy. So those are the kind of two official strict rules. There's differences between different bishops and different places where you might live, but that's generally the case across the Church of England.
Yeah. And what's your feeling about intimate relationships, Charlie? I mean, this is a subject that people kind of don't like talking about, but the reality is that intimate sexual relationship is one of the great joys of a relationship. And you're not allowed to do that. How does that make you feel as an individual?
Well, it just feels deeply unchristian. I mean, it just feels like we're separating relationality, the way we relate to one another, intimacy and sexuality, in a totally arbitrary and false way. That's the opposite of what, if we talk about ourselves as embodied people, if our theology is all about us being people who live in bodies and are coherent, integrated wholes, yet we're then told that sexuality nonetheless can be kind of sliced out of that. And for me, this idea of, I struggle to really know what the church means when it talks about sex, to be quite honest. I'm not really sure what the church means when it talks about celibacy. How do you determine if a relationship is sexual or not? How do you determine whether it's intimate or not? How far is too far? And the fact that these questions sound so ridiculous suggests to me that the whole concept of this is completely wrong. And of course, the document which I've just mentioned, Issues in Human Sexuality, was never meant to be used for this purpose. It was a kind of stepping stone on a conversation, and instead we've got to this state where we basically separate sex from everything else. That seems to me to be both really bizarre and also just deeply, deeply unfair, not only to clergy, because we're used to that, but to partners as well.
It's a strange one. I mean, I find it peculiar that in what other job would you be asked these questions? Do you promise not to? Quite. And it just seems really archaic. Which leads me to ask the question, Charlie, what's it like being a gay priest in the Church of England today?
It's quite tough. I'm just back from the United States, and the church in America, the Episcopal Church, has kind of not fully dealt with, but in many ways has dealt with this question. And I've suddenly realized quite how difficult it can be to be a gay priest in England. I was having conversations there and getting on with things there, and I realized I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder or checking the exact form of words I was using, or indeed kind of carrying some of that internalized homophobia that an institution creates for you. So it's tough. And I think sometimes because we just get on with it, and because most of us have a vocation to be a priest that is more than our identity, our sexuality, and so on, we just get on with it. And sometimes I feel like because we're so effective at just getting on with it, the pain and the difficulty and the challenge is just not heard. And I think that's a real sadness, because people will leave and do leave the church because it's just the tension becomes too much.
Yeah, I think that's really important what you say about that most people just want to get on with it. My own associate priest working with me is in a same-sex relationship, as was my training incumbent, and ultimately they just wanted to get on and do the job, but of course it's very difficult to do that, isn't it, with what is going on, and as the synod has come to this decision, Charlie, that prayers can be offered. This, in many ways, as I suspected it would, has actually created a huge chasm now, hasn't it? What's your initial feelings? Or what were your initial feelings when you saw that was passed at Synod?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've said many times about this decision that I was kind of disappointed but not surprised. I mean, I think the way that it was reported in the secular media, the normal media, the Church of England says no to same-sex marriage is the reality. That is what the church has said. And I think some people in the church are really surprised that that was how it was received, because for many people, particularly for those who are not themselves, LGBT, their response was kind of, well, we're offering blessings, it's something. And it's true, offering blessings is something. Up until now, we've not been able to do anything. And of course, there is practice where people do things, but the official rules have been pretty clear that we shouldn't be offering kind of public and specific blessings for people. And it's something, and I think it's the first. I think it's the foot in the door territory. You can't put this all back in the Pandora's box, but it's disappointing. It means yet again, when folk come to us and say, "Can we get married?" We've been Christians for 50 years, and we've been together for 50 of those. Our response is no. Whereas someone turns up and lives in the parish and wants to get married and has never been to church, and the answer is yes, and that feels to me, and we have to say yes. That to me just feels a completely wrong-headed way of doing things.
When that was going on at Synod, I have to say, Charlie, that was one of the most stressful things I've experienced as a priest, and I voted in favour of the prayers and blessings, but it was with a heavy heart. I really wanted to say, no, this is not enough, and I think a lot of people in that room felt the same. But now that decision has been taken, it seems to me that there's a lot of manoeuvring, shenanigans going on, people kind of trying to get their house in order, what we do next, how we potentially move this forward, and from a more conservative position, how we can stop this. Where do you see things as they stand now?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of fear being stoked, which I really think is, again, without wanting to label people as unchristian, I think it's extremely unchristian as a mode of operation to stir up fear where there need not to be any. Of course, there are genuine concerns about, how people are able to inhabit a space where some people say one thing, other people say another thing. But, there's a really clear concerted campaign to try and stop anything from happening and to push rollback on what's happened from General Synod. My feeling is this is going to happen. It's been very clearly referred to as the implementation groups that we're part of, not there's no kind of, it's not a discussion group, it's an implementation. Of course, there's a disagreement as to what we're implementing. And I think if we don't address things like clergy celibacy and marriage, then frankly, this whole thing has been a bit of a waste of time. I have to say, I'm not convinced there's going to be thousands of people queuing up for this kind of not quite marriage ceremony. There'll be some, because some people have got married civilly, but we need to, there needs to be a significant shift here. And that's the direction that Synod has moved in. We've just got a lot of opposition, I think.
And whilst all that's going on, all this debate and conjecture going on, Charlie, there is a whole world of people out there that just don't care, aren't there? They just look at us and think, what on earth is going on? And I mean, I have to say, if I was a gay man, I wouldn't want anything to do with it. What is the thing that keeps you within the Church of England? What is your kind of driving force? Is it to kind of be your contribution to what might happen in years to come, or is it for your self-interest, or is it something else? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. So firstly, my involvement in the church is because I think that what we proclaim ultimately as the gospel is true. And I wouldn't be a priest if that wasn't the case. And frankly, I just want to be allowed to just get on with that. I'm a bit of a reluctant activist. People don't believe this, but it's true. I'm involved in this because I think that I'm trying to tell the truth about something. And I think that's what being a priest is about in general. I think there will be change. I'm kept there because of a hope, a genuine hope that things will change, because I genuinely believe that what we're saying is true. I genuinely believe that a church that includes, affirms, welcomes, and recognizes LGBT people in its midst is a healthier and better church, better able to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, that's my kind of starting point. But I also wonder if I'm called to be a bit awkward. I mean, I think people are in generations, across centuries, millennia even, there have been awkward people in the church who have sat there and refused to move and said, I'm just as much Christian as you, by the way. And you can't say I'm not. And I wonder sometimes if those of us who are kind of raising our voices a bit about LGBT issues are those awkward Christians for this generation. And maybe that's what we're called to be. It's not comfortable for us either. But maybe that's why I'm here. I'm never sure why God called me to the church, really. It all seemed like a very strange idea, but, that's God's fault.
I think a lot of priests think like that, actually.
Yeah, quite.
A few weeks ago, I was in a meeting, Charlie, where a conservative evangelical said he was embarrassed to be part of the Church of England, which saddened me greatly. I wonder what you think, if the church does move forward and if ultimately becomes more inclusive, but the conservative wing of the church moves away, is that a price worth paying?
Well, I don't think it has to happen. I think it's a choice. And we've heard a lot about people breaking away, which feels to me to be often sitting in the realm of threat rather than in the realm of wanting to have a constructive conversation. At the moment, the reality is that for many conservative evangelicals, there is a refusal to compromise whatsoever. And even the idea of compromise is itself a compromise. And so in a sense, if people are unable to live in a church where there are differences of opinions that are being honestly expressed, well, I'm not sure how we can call ourselves a church at that point, that the work's already done there. We already disagree. There is already fundamental disagreement within the church. There's been we hear a lot now about kind of how those of us who would like things to change are somehow causing division or stimulating division and the rest of it. It's already there. It's just being named now. We're just finally being honest about it. And I really think that the church grows healthier by being honest about what it actually thinks. I don't think we'll see a great turn away. There are plenty of people who are very angry, very upset, very worried about the future. But I don't think there'll be a great turning away. But I do think there does need to be kindness from those of us who are on the affirming side to find a way of trying to be as generous as possible to those with whom we disagree, whilst at the same time recognizing that if I had kids, I wouldn't want them going to one of their churches. I just wouldn't. And especially if I had queer kids, I just would not want them going to a church where they're told they're less than.
Yeah, I entirely agree, Charlie. But I'm wondering if I can ask you this, as in your capacity as a priest and as a psychiatrist, that that we've got some very clever people arguing for both cases, haven't we? We've got some very academics who argue the conservative literal scripture rationale, and then there are more on the liberal leaning people like yourself and I who don't agree that to be true. Is one of us right and one of us is wrong?
Well, I guess we probably are. I mean, I'm not sure that any one of us is entirely right. I think though we have to be open to the possibility of the development of doctrine, to the development of what we understand to be true. And I think all of us, therefore, have a contribution to make to that. The one voice that was for a long time sort of silent in many debates about sexuality was people who themselves were LGBT, and that's changing. But I think ultimately there, as with all things, we always try to avoid binaries. We try to say that someone isn't wrong because someone else is right and the rest of it. But there is a kind of binary here. Either God isn't upset by same-sex relationships or God is upset by same-sex relationships. But I think ultimately it's about trying to live with integrity before God in the way that we understand our theology, our Bible, our church history and the rest of it. That I think is the most important thing. And actually the problem is quite often people with our integrity have been told that we don't have integrity, and I think that's the problem. I'm very happy for people to say, I just do not agree with you. I cannot get to the same place as you, and hold that position with integrity. But please don't question mine. And maybe that's what this blessings thing is doing. Maybe that's the first step in that process.
Yeah, and as somebody who's I've experienced people stepping over the line, as it were, in terms of their responses. I've had some rather awful comments made to me, and I'm sure you have had similar. Charlie, how do you deal with that as a Christian? How do you wrestle with that when somebody does step over the line, which does happen, and I've seen it happen myself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm blessed with a thick skin. I mean, like a really thick skin. I'm sometimes appalled at how much nonsense I'm willing to take, really. I think probably growing up in a boarding school has caused the thick skin to grow pretty impressive. But I don't know. I mean, I think it needs to be called out. And I think the Church of England has something called the pastoral principles, which I've returned to more and more over the last little while, thinking about, they're readily accessible online, but they're thinking about things like paying attention to power, speaking into silence, and so on. These are actually helpful ways of doing conversations. The problem is there's no point having principles, having a list of principles if they're not put into effect. And so for me, when I face abuse, I try not to lash out, although it's sometimes hard not to. But I am aware that as a queer Christian, I'm often held up to a higher standard than many others who are then throwing things at us and just trying to needle in to try and get us to say that thing so they can then report us to the bishop, which happens on a not infrequent basis and is extremely tiresome. So, it's hard, but we need to speak to each other as Christians. And sometimes we need to remind ourselves as well that we're speaking about other Christians. It's easy to get angry and upset. And sometimes it's good just to remind ourselves that, there's a bigger picture here.
Something I've learned through being on Synod is how difficult it is being on Synod and where the Church of England sits in the whole Anglican communion. Do you think that the Church of England holds too much responsibility? I'm kind of going with this, Charlie, with the news from the Ugandan church in terms of homosexuality being criminalized and the church supporting that there, and the very slow response from the senior team of the Church of England. And it kind of, it's like nobody wants to make the first move. And I know that some stuff has come out today as we record this from the Archbishop of Canterbury and Stephen Cottrell, but we're completely different countries, aren't we? We have different cultures, different ways of living. Is it kind of time the Church of England says, no, we're the Church of England, we can't take responsibility for what goes on in the whole Anglican communion? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's inexplicable that it's taken so long for the archbishops to have said anything about what's going on in Uganda. I cannot think of a possible reasonable excuse for taking this long.
So what is it? Why did it take so long, do you think, Charlie?
I don't know. I mean, it's clear that the other bishops were waiting for the archbishops to say something, or the archbishop to say something. It's clear that wasn't going to happen. And it's clear that other bishops then felt the need to start saying things. And I'm sure, it's reasonable. There are questions around having private conversations with other church leaders, the archbishops or the Archbishop of Canterbury perhaps speaking with the Archbishop of Uganda privately and so on. So there's lots of reasons for things not to be knee-jerk and immediate. But I mean, several weeks is just ridiculous. And so I don't know, but it's inexcusable. And I'm afraid, this is one of those things in which the church should be held to account, and the church will not be held to account. And this will be, it's happened before with Nigeria, it's happened with Ghana. Every time something like this happens, there's a delay, and then people like me are told to kind of calm our heads and to stop getting upset about it. Well, tell that to queer Ugandans. They're going to be imprisoned for being who they are. So, back to your question on the communion, it's really tricky because we have a colonial communion. We have a communion that almost inevitably has a white person as its head. Almost inevitably, that person's a man, and almost inevitably, that person's English. Parce to the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, he was Welsh, but in general, it's going to be from the English Church. So, and yet they're holding this position by right as the head of the whole communion, which is the language that the Anglican Communion uses about itself, not language I would necessarily think is comfortable. So that's very strange. And we've just been tinkering around with the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, as opposed to recognizing that a colonial communion in a post-colonial age is no longer on. The problem is, if you have a leader like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's seen as the leader of the communion, how do you get to a position where that person can make a serious statement to another bishop, where it's not seen as a power differential? It ultimately is, and it's white people telling non-white people what to do. We need to move away from that kind of differential, I think, before we can start having the serious conversations which we need to be having. But we're just not having them, and it's just so depressing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And just think of what you said a bit earlier, just trying to open the door. I suppose once doors are opened in the Church of England, you can't really shut them again. And I was wondering if you think it's how feasible or how likely is that the next Archbishop, either of Canterbury or York, could be a woman?
Well, I'd hope it was possible. The level of institutionalized misogyny in the Church of England is just astounding. I keep hearing it referred to as a minority issue. People need to read their demographics. It's not a minority issue; it's a majority issue. So this is so. I would hope it could be the case, and I would hope that I'm afraid it would be pandering if the argument, well, the communion was used to prevent a woman from being the next archbishop. So I would hope it's possible.
We could, Charlie, Mike's just gone off. We could be entering realms, though, couldn't we, where that happened, which would create another schism. But I'm trying to think of where I'm leading with this, Charlie. Is some of the noises I'm hearing about potential resolutions is, and I'm sure you will have heard this as well, is the potential for a third province to be created, either, for want of a better word, the gays and all the the liberals, or a third province for the Conservatives. I just think that sounds ridiculous in my mind. But where do you see that going?
Yeah, I don't see there being any Episcopal support for that, any support from the bishops, not least because of what's happened with women's ordination. We'd end up, even having what we have as these flying bishops, having bishops covering particular parishes if they don't like gay people. I think the idea of that's just, I think it's for the birds. And I don't think there's any real desire to go towards a more structural change in the church. Not least because we're not talking about big numbers here. I think the interesting thing that we hear a lot of is, we hear, well, the liberals should just go and form their own province. But actually, the majority of the Church of England is in favor of same-sex marriage, in favor of having LGBT members and all the rest of it. That being the case, it's not the liberals who are going to need to make a separate province, however many times we're told that we're in the minority. Mm. The synod is an interesting place because the representative noise that comes from a particular conservative group is absolutely unrepresentative of the wider church. And that's a structural problem, which is incredibly dull, but nonetheless incredibly important, because it's completely changing the way that the church appears to the wider world and how the church makes decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just kind of bring this whole discussion around this matter to a head, what's your kind of short-term expectations, Charlie, and maybe 5-10 years down the road, where do you see us?
So I think the outcome of this Living in Love and Faith project and the proposals at the General Synod, I think we're likely to see things later this year, probably at the November Synod. I think there'll be things to iron out after that, but I think we'll have the majority of the information then, and I don't think we'll see anything in a month's time. And I don't think I'm letting any secrets out of the bag there. I think we'll see clergy. I think the celibacy rule. I think what will happen is that the difference between clergy and laity will be lifted. And so the celibacy rule for clergy, the refusal of marriage for clergy, and the rest of it will be lifted. I think these blessings will be permitted for people who are both in civil marriages and in civil partnerships. And I think that's where we'll sit for a few years. But one bishop very naively and almost beautifully said to me, well, at least that's put that to bed now. The idea that this is going to stop is just for the birds again. There has to be a recognition that we are still denying queer people equal access to the sacraments, if we call it a sacrament, or at least to church order if we won't go that far. So this is fundamentally problematic for an institution. I think 2-3 years' time, there'll be a new synod elected. Who knows what will happen in the next synod? But if people think this is not going to be one of the main election causes for the next general synod and legislative business for the next general synod in terms of moving towards marriage, then they're living in fantasy land. So blessings this year, removal of celibacy and allowing of marriage, and then I think intermarriage itself in the next few years. It's just, who knows if there'll be anyone to listen anymore or care about what the Church of England thinks about this stuff.
Well, I was going to just say, I think when on my first sitting in synod, the presidential address was suggesting that national attendance now is below 1%. I suppose the question I have is, do you think the Church of England can survive this regardless?
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of questions about what the Church of England even is now. The Church of England is changing dramatically in front of our eyes, in terms of the way that we worship, in terms of what we think of ourselves as in relation to the nation. We're no longer a church that marries you if you come calling. We're a church that marries you if you come calling, provided that it's to someone of the opposite sex. We've changed almost by mistake our fundamental relationship with the state. And queer people turn up to churches and realize that they're not welcome, or their families do, so we're producing so much trouble for ourselves. I don't know. I mean, I hope it survives, but I don't think that the institutional survival of the Church of England is the same as the institutional survival, or rather the survival of the gospel. And so I don't know, but we seem so inward looking and so determined to keep it, some of the things we've been talking about, keep everybody in the tent. That's great. I'm in favor of that, but I also want other people to come into the tent. I also want our tent to get bigger. I want the gospel message to be spread throughout the whole country and the world and the rest of it. And we're just failing impressively on that front. It's not just about queer issues, but we're failing on that front, and we've got so much more work to do.
Charlie, I don't want to finish this interview on the negatives. Tell me what you love about your ministry, because I mean, I get bogged down in the stuff that we've been talking about, and if people have been listening to this, they will, for the first time, about church politics, they're probably thinking, "Oh my goodness me!" But there are some joys, aren't there? Please tell me there are in your world. What are those joys for you, Charlie?
There are. People say to me, "Oh, I'm not going to come to your church because I just hear you preaching about gay things all the time." I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. In the church, sorry, hang on. There's something going past the window very loudly. Let me try that again. Lots of people say to me, I'm not coming to your church because you just preach about gay things all the time, which is just not the truth. The reality is, the parish I'm in is the most life-giving experience in the world. We have a huge number of people from the Windrush generation. So we've got a lot of folk from Barbados, Jamaica. We've also got a lot of folk from West Africa, some from East Africa, and a huge number of increased congregation from South America. We have the most unbelievably diverse parish where everybody happens to find ways to get on with one another, and not just tolerate one another, but find ways to kind of, rejoice in each other. And at our Pentecost service a couple of weeks ago, we have a lunch afterwards, an international lunch where everyone brings cuisine from their own place. We had everybody trying everyone's cuisine. We had Ecuadorian dancers in the church. In 2 weeks' time, we've got our Windrush celebration. It's just this place is vibrant and full of gospel joy. So the reality is, the day-to-day mission of the church is amazing and great and wonderful, and the people that we get to serve makes this all worth it. I just wish we could stop talking about something which to me is so completely obvious, and just move on from that and get back to proclaiming the gospel and serving people, because that's what we're meant to be doing. That's what I love. That's what I absolutely love doing. That's why I'm a priest in the first place.
Well, amen to that, Charlie. Absolutely. Charlie, it's been lovely talking to you. I've been following you with interest on Twitter. I want to thank you for what you're doing for the cause, because, we might not change the world today, but I think people like yourself are hopefully creating a new landscape down the road, and that's really important. I just want to thank you for coming on. I want for people who are watching this to check out the Godcast. There's lots of religious discussions. There's lots of celebrities, musicians, and sports people. But for now, from Alex Frost, host of the Godcast, author of Our Daily Bread, Argos to the Altar, Charlie Bell, thank you for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much.